Before sunrise on April 22, 2025, the quiet woods west of Kursk were broken by fire. At 5:13 a.m., 3 rockets screamed across the sky, and in less than a minute and a half, an entire artillery regiment ceased to exist. The targets were no ordinary soldiers. They were North Korean reinforcements flown across continents to bolster Russia's collapsing front. 60 men, 3 of Pyongyang's heaviest guns, trucks loaded with thousands of pounds of shells. In 91 seconds, all of it was gone. What followed wasn't confusion. It was absence. No signals on the radios, no movement on thermal scans, no survivors crawling from the wreckage. For Russian commanders, the silence was as devastating as the explosions themselves. And that silence carried a message. Ukraine had shown that survival in this war isn't measured by how many troops you have or how much firepower you bring. It's measured in seconds. And those 91 seconds rewrote the rules of the battlefield. The rockets that hit the clearing were HIMARS munitions, each carrying over 200 pounds of high explosive. Fired in quick succession, they tore through the pre-dawn sky at nearly Mach 3. From the moment they launched, the regiment had less than 2 minutes to live. The first rocket hit with surgical precision. The earth convulsed on impact, throwing soil into the air as though the ground itself had been torn open. Pines that had stood for decades were flattened in seconds, toppling outward in concentric waves. Shock waves rolled through the forest, cracking branches and shaking the air for hundreds of yards. The second rocket found its mark in the artillery pit. In an instant, steel that had been cast to withstand enormous pressure was reduced to fragments. The Koksan gun crews never had the chance to fire. Barrels the length of city buses were ripped free of their carriages and hurled into the tree line, crashing through trunks before embedding deep into the soil. The third warhead struck the most volatile target, the ammunition trucks. Each vehicle had carried thousands of pounds of shells and propellant. The explosion was instantaneous and merciless. Flames raced through the clearing, followed by a chain of secondary blasts so intense that the shock registered miles away. Temperatures soared past 2,000 degrees, bending and twisting even the thickest armor plating. For the men on the ground, there was no chance to react. Radios went silent mid-transmission. Calls for confirmation from Russian command were met with nothing but static. Helmets and rifles were thrown hundreds of feet, scattered like toys across the burning clearing. The reinforced armor of the guns, once a symbol of durability, buckled and twisted under the inferno. By the time the smoke began to climb into the sky, the regiment had been erased. It no longer existed in any recognizable form. What had been touted as a powerful reinforcement was now nothing but wreckage and fire. Above it all, a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone hovered in silence, its camera capturing the wreckage in high definition. What it sent back to Kyiv was not a battlefield. It was a cratered graveyard where nothing moved but fire and drifting ash. At 5:16 a.m., 3 minutes after the strike, the drone made another slow circle over the clearing. Its wingspan was barely wider than a dinner table, but its lens captured everything in merciless clarity. Where just minutes before 3 170 mm Koksan guns had stood, each a towering machine nearly 30 tons in weight, there was now only wreckage. One barrel had been ripped apart completely, split down the middle like broken glass, and hurled deep into the tree line. Another glowed a searing red, bent at a grotesque angle as if the steel itself had melted under the heat that had climbed beyond 2,000 degrees. The once formidable artillery pieces, paraded by Moscow as symbols of strength, had been reduced to twisted monuments of failure. The ammunition trucks, each carrying nearly 20,000 pounds of shells and propellant charges, had fared no better. Entire frames had melted into the soil, charred metal dripping like wax from shattered chassis. The violence of the blasts had been so severe that shards of steel now jutted from tree trunks 40 feet above ground, a frozen record of the force that had ripped through the clearing. The drone's sensors scanned for movement, for survivors, for any sign of life that might indicate the regiment had endured. Nothing. Thermal scans showed no heat signatures beyond the fires. Radios remained silent. Helmets were reduced to pools of slag. Rifles lay warped and twisted like strands of wire. 60 men had been erased in less than 2 minutes. Back in Moscow, the first images began to arrive in the command centers. Officers who had pushed for North Korea's elite reinforcements now stared at a nightmare. This was not a battlefield setback, not an inconvenience to be explained away in reports. It was a total annihilation. An entire reinforcement package had been obliterated before it ever fired a single shot. For the Russian staff, the message was brutal. Every foreign unit sent to Ukraine had a target painted on its back. And for Pyongyang, it was humiliation broadcast in flames. By the time the sun began to rise, the impact of the Kursk strike had already spread far beyond the smoldering forest. In Moscow, the stunned silence inside command posts gave way to frantic, clipped orders. Channels buzzed with directives to halt further deployments. Every North Korean artillery battery that had been slated for movement toward the Western Front was abruptly pulled back. What only days earlier had been paraded as evidence of Russia's growing international support was now seen as a dangerous liability. The destruction of 3 guns was not about numbers on a ledger. It was about the collapse of credibility. For North Korea, the humiliation was even sharper. Just weeks earlier, state television in Pyongyang had broadcast triumphant images of their artillery rolling across Red Square. The Koksan guns had been presented as a proud symbol of brotherhood with Moscow, a projection of strength meant to reassure domestic audiences and intimidate foreign ones. Now, those same machines lay scattered across a Russian forest in pieces, reduced to twisted steel and ash. The men chosen to operate them, hand-picked for their loyalty and skill, never fired a single round. They were gone in less than 2 minutes, their absence marked only by silence. Families 4,000 miles away would not receive bodies to bury or graves to tend. They would receive nothing at all. Among the 15,000 North Korean troops still stationed on Russian soil, morale collapsed overnight. The message was unmistakable. Kursk was not a battle to be celebrated or avenged. It was a warning carved into the ground. Reinforcements would not be reinforcements at all. They would be targets. The optics were devastating. What had been intended as a powerful demonstration of unity between Moscow and Pyongyang had instead turned into a spectacle of shared humiliation. Russia's desperation had been exposed in the harshest possible way, and North Korea's pride had been burned to ash. Ukraine never needed a press conference to explain what happened in the Kursk forest. The wreckage itself became the statement. 3 rockets, each costing under $150,000, had erased equipment valued at more than $50 million and silenced 60 foreign gunners in less than 2 minutes. The math alone was staggering. It revealed a destructive ratio of nearly 300 to 1, a battlefield exchange that no army could ignore. That efficiency carried a meaning far deeper than the craters on the ground. Kiev had shown it could bleed Russia steadily, without draining its own resources. Every convoy moving across the border, every weapon delivered by a foreign partner, every so-called reinforcement flown in from abroad was no longer a show of strength. It was a target waiting to be marked, tracked, and eliminated. and in the details of the strike, analysts saw an unmistakable layer of partnership. The munitions were American-made HIMARS rockets. The coordinates had been refined through satellite data from orbit, narrowed to inches. The reconnaissance drone circling overhead followed NATO doctrine to adjust the strike in real time. Washington had not pressed the launch button, but its fingerprints were clear in every stage of the attack. That made the Kursk strike more than Ukraine's message alone. It was a joint warning to Moscow and to Pyongyang. The message was precise and unforgiving. Restraint has limits, and imported firepower does not create safety. Reinforcements from abroad don't shield Russia. They only create larger, clearer targets. And when those targets are found, the next strike will come just as quickly and with the same precision. Within 72 hours of the Kursk strike, NATO observers began reporting changes that were impossible to miss. Along the front, Russian long-range artillery fire dropped by nearly 40%. Batteries that had once pounded Ukrainian defenses relentlessly fell silent. The fear was obvious. Units that had grown accustomed to operating with impunity now hesitated, afraid they too might be marked, tracked, and erased in seconds. Kursk had proven beyond doubt that survival in this war was not about how many guns you possessed or how deep your fortifications ran. It was about whether you could outlast the next 91 seconds. Moscow attempted to suppress the fallout, but silence could not contain it. Despite censorship, images of the aftermath leaked quickly through encrypted Russian channels. Grainy but unmistakable photographs showed artillery barrels warped like plastic, massive craters gouged 30 feet wide, helmets fused into pools of slag, and wreckage scattered like children's toys. For soldiers still in the field, these images carried a weight that propaganda could not erase. The whispers spread from trench to trench. Kursk was more than a strike. It was a demonstration, a warning that even the strongest positions, even the most distant reinforcements, could be annihilated without warning. In Pyongyang, the response was frantic. Officials scrambled to bury the truth, but reality seeped through in satellite photos and intercepted communications. Families of the gunners, thousands of miles away, demanded answers that no one in authority could give. Their sons had been sent across a continent to fight in a foreign war, and in less than 2 minutes they had been erased, leaving no bodies to return, no graves to mark. International analysts wasted no time drawing their conclusions. Kursk was not the start of a large-scale offensive. It was never meant to be. It was a surgical intervention, timed and executed with precision, designed to reshape the narrative of the battlefield. Ukraine had demonstrated that with patience and accuracy, even reinforcements once considered untouchable could be reduced to silence before firing a single shot. The Kursk forest still bears the scar. Blackened soil where trucks once stood, splintered trees crushed in rings around smoking craters, rusting fragments of steel half buried in ash. What had once been a busy artillery site is now a graveyard without bodies. For Russia, the wound was humiliation. Their reliance on foreign reinforcements had been turned against them in under 2 minutes. For North Korea, it was historic shame. Soldiers once hailed as elite vanished without a trace, leaving only melted helmets and twisted gun barrels. But the legacy of Kursk goes beyond Moscow and Pyongyang. It reshaped the psychology of the battlefield. Commanders everywhere now ask the same question. How many seconds do we really have before the next strike finds us? 91 seconds. That is all it took to erase men, machines, and months of propaganda. That is the new clock ticking in every bunker, every convoy, every command post. The war is no longer measured in battles. It is measured in moments. And the haunting question that echoes from that scarred forest is this: Where will the next 91 seconds fall? The Kursk strike will not be remembered for its size, but for its precision. 3 rockets, 91 seconds. 60 men and millions of dollars in weaponry erased before dawn. It was not simply a battlefield success. It was a message written in fire and silence. For Russia, it exposed weakness. For North Korea, it delivered humiliation that propaganda could not conceal. And for the rest of the world, it proved that in modern warfare, the balance of power is not determined by the biggest army, but by the seconds it takes to strike. That is the reality of the war's 3rd year. Survival is no longer about fortresses or numbers. It is about time and how quickly it can run out. If you believe these stories matter, if you want the truth of this war told before it disappears under censorship and propaganda, then stand with us. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Every click keeps the truth alive.